Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar discussion topic video. This one is going to be all about the Legend of Korra villains. So a few people asked me to do a discussion topic just kind of generally on the villains, so I decided why not. We had a pretty good discussion in a YouTube post that I put up a few days ago, so why not do a video on the topic as well. So yeah, this is going to be fairly general, nothing specific really. I'll be talking about all the villains from all 4 books of Korra, and if you guys think this video is interesting, I might do one for the villains of Avatar as well. So yeah, we're going to be talking about sort of backstories, motivations, what makes the villains good, maybe some of the weaknesses, things that we need to learn or know about the villains if we ever got more content with them, and just basically what makes them tick. So let's get straight into it. I suppose it's going to be a relatively long video just because I have 4 whole books to cover. The villains are such a crucial part of each book. It's basically like almost like recapping the whole series. But anyway, let's get into it. Let's start off with Book 1, Air. Now, of course, Amon/Unalaq is the main villain, but I don't think you can talk about villains in Book 1 without bringing in Unalaq. And I think at the point at which you bring in Unalaq and Unalaq, you have to bring in Yakone as well. It's all linked. Korra has to deal with the threat of Amon and Unalaq because of what happened in the past with Aang dealing with Yakone. And that's a really great connection of like how Korra makes her first link into Aang is by Aang trying to warn her about the threat of basically the lineage of Yakone with their psychic bloodbending as well as the ability to bloodbend without the need for there to be a full moon out. And this is a great plot point because everyone loved bloodbending from Avatar, this dark technique. And now you take it to this whole other level with this major incident in Republic City. And now Yakone ultimately is a fairly standard bad guy, just criminal empire trying to take over the city from the kind of underbelly with the criminals, taken down by Aang. You know, he avoids, all the trials up until the point at which, the evidence mounts up so much that they just have to be like, okay, look, all the evidence points to you being a bloodbender, and even though technically we don't know anything about, there's no evidence of you bloodbending during the days of a full moon, we have to just account for the fact that there can be special benders in the world, and you must be one of them. And that leads, of course, to the confrontation with Aang and so on eventually. Yakone gets his bending taken away, and this is what starts off this whole path. Because what's interesting is after this, Yakone actually starts a new life. He gets married to a woman in the Northern Water Tribe, and they have 2 kids, and their family seems to be going very well. He's left the criminal past behind with his new face and new life. And I get the impression initially isn't really thinking about returning to it again, or there's no opportunities whatsoever. That this could just be it, a happy, simpler life, until the kids discover that they're waterbenders, and specifically later on that they're bloodbenders with the same abilities as Yakone had. And this is where everything changes, and this is kind of what informs Amon/Unalaq's motivation as a character. Why a bender would create a non-bender revolution against benders and go as far as to take away the bending of nearly everyone in Republic City. And this is the point with all of the villains, is that ultimately they are presented as all being sort of extremists in a way. They all take a certain ideal to an extreme that makes them villains that need to be taken down. But the series in the end, especially in Book 4 with Toph talking to Korra, notes that, there was value to what the villains were doing, that they started from a point with sort of good intent, but took it so far that they had to be taken down, and that's why they're considered villains. So it's so interesting to look at the villains from those 2 points of what is their extreme viewpoint, and then what is the sort of good ideal behind it all that there's some value to. So with Amon, the extreme, of course, is basically the Equalists becoming a terrorist organization, and going so far as to basically just, without caring about the individuals whatsoever, just if you're a bender, being targeted purely on the basis that you are a bender, regardless of if you're a triad, a police officer, pro bender, whatever, your bending is getting taken away, because that is what the movement is about. He turns people who have issues with benders into sort of violent extremists and stealing this ability from people without care, basically, just to get what he sees as his revenge, because in his mind, of course, bending ruined his life, his family, so that's what he's going to do going forward by, joining up with someone who feels similarly, I suppose, about benders in Hiroshi, who's, again, also one of the villains in book one. So I think, that extreme viewpoint, it's like, okay, interesting. But the core point behind it is that when Korra gets to the city, she immediately notices these problems that have to be dealt with, of mainly the triads and the fact that the Metalbender police force seems somewhat lax in dealing with them, as sort of evidenced by the fact that they focus more on capturing Korra than they do about capturing the triads, who are kind of hassling mainly non-benders. And I think that that's shown by the fact that going into book two and sort of onwards, the police force does sort of tackle the triads a little bit more. It's why they're not as present in the show after the first book. Basically, they're only really in book 1 and 2, and they're not so much in the other books, and they're much smaller as we see them in the Korra comics and so on. It's because of sort of the result. So Amon's kind of core idea of just equality is the good of what he's trying to accomplish here. There is a need for a shift between the benders and the non-benders within Republic City, and while he does it the wrong way, he ends up, sort of leading to change. People realize that while that was wrong, they don't just dismiss everything he was about, and instead realize that, okay, we'll make some changes to address what was going on here. The main one, of course, being they switch from having the Republic City Council, which mainly features bender representatives from each nation, and instead shift to just the people of Republic City elect their own leader. And what we see is that the first president is a non-bender, and then in the comics, the second president is also a non-bender. So they very much succeed in everything that they wanted in that case, that the benders elect, I suppose the benders and non-benders together in a way elect non-bender leaders, and it's never presented anywhere in the story that there is an issue from benders towards the fact that their president is a non-bender. So it sort of becomes this sort of issue of the core things to be dealt with were just the triads and a little bit more focused leadership that wasn't just kind of the sort of bending elite, I suppose. And he ended up, affecting some change, perhaps, by, of course, going about it the wrong way, but he definitely opened Korra's eyes to some of these situations. And I think that's the most interesting thing about Amon, of he hits all of the key points you want from a villain. He's unique, has a unique power and ability with, the mystery surrounding him initially, but then being revealed to be a psychic bloodbender as well, and being the most powerful of them as well. Inventing this ability to use sort of bloodbending to sort of chi block someone permanently internally. Very, very cool technique. About the only thing missing for Amon, really, is covering some of the story between when he leaves and then when he next appears next to Hiroshi as part of the Equalists. How did he actually go about inventing the takeaway bending technique? Where did the mask come from? What inspired that and the story that he says to everyone? How did he meet Hiroshi? Where did he get the lieutenant from? And so on. Just those initial direct setup for what we see in book one. And then it's interesting because Skeletons in the Closet in book one is a very, very important episode in terms of showing us that backstory of really right up until he does the bloodbending training with them, it's going okay. But the second he sees that they're so skilled that they could fulfill his revenge for him, it just goes completely wrong. He only starts to train them. They, I suppose, spend less and less time with the mother and become more and more sort of isolated out in the tundras, just training over and over again. And especially the fact that like he forces them to use bloodbending on animals, like obviously controlling them against their will, and then especially when he asks them to do it against each other, it highlights why Katara made sure to have the ability outlawed. And here's, you know, two kids who suffered greatly by being forced to learn and develop this technique. And of course you get the whole tragic dynamic, of course, with the two brothers of never wanting to go ahead with their father's kind of quest for revenge, but ending up sort of falling in a way to like the family curse almost of Noatak shows up again, and he's basically doing that just from a different point of view. He's still sort of taking over the city, but with a different perspective. The same with Tarlok. He's doing much the same that Yakone did, but this time he's got an actual political position, but he's still doing all this underhanded stuff and manipulation and sort of criminal stuff in the background. And it makes the ending of the two brothers, and in a way the whole Yakone family, all the more tragic. Of like, when Noatak left, Yakone just lived out the rest of his life with a, I suppose, pretty depressing existence, and that really just ruined the family atmosphere. And so it must have been terrible for Tarlok and the mother, like, living with him those last few years of his life. And so it makes Tarlok's decision to kill him and Amon at the end so powerful and just kind of brutal and tragic, because he knows that basically the path Amon is on is that he's going to do exactly the same that Yakone did. Yakone was out of the criminal underworld, started again in the north, but then the second something changed, he was back in with the kids. And I suppose the idea is that he saw Amon doing the same. He'll leave, we'll start again. But what if Amon started the family and his kids had something going on? What if something else came up? He would find another way to go back and take revenge, and he can almost see that in himself as well. So remove the family from the world, bring the curse, the tragic ending of this family to an end. It's very, very dark, but it just works, and it makes the atmosphere of book one, I think, so strong with how interestingly interlinked everything is. And again, I think the equality kind of perspective works, because you do ultimately have the two brothers kind of coming at each other at conflict from different points of view. And because Amon basically gets non-benders fighting against benders, Tarlok doubles down on the sort of almost oppression of non-benders, and so you have them both representing the extremes, but on opposite sides. And you know, they both sort of help Korra to see the sort of kind of tactic she was using of like, she also sort of uses her bending to sort of control people to a degree, and she kind of learns to move past that. So definitely the case of sort of Korra learning a bit from her book one villains, I think, is true. Things do change because of what happens here, and it's a very good introduction to the style of villain that we are doing in Legend of Korra. So let's move on to book 2 next, with Unalaq, who by most of the fandom is viewed as being the weakest villain, but I think he's actually a really strong villain who has a lot of interesting nuance to him. So the theme that they go for with with Unalaq is that he's all about spirituality. Like, as Toph says when she explains what she views as being the sort of positives that each of the villains brought. For Amon, it was equality. For Unalaq, is that he brought the spirit back, which is exactly the point that's made here. A lot of people kind of frame this as like, oh, I don't understand what Unalaq is about with all this spiritual mumbo-jumbo. But it's a very simple point, fundamentally. It's just, he is a very spiritual man. He doesn't like what he sees with regards to how the world, and especially the Southern Water Tribe, is with regards to their spirituality. They're not very spiritual. In the first episode of Book 2, we go to the south for the Glacier Spirits Festival, and nothing about the festival is celebrating spirits. Nothing is spiritual about it in any sense. It just is like a fair, a carnival type thing. it has no elements of, I suppose, what it once was as a tradition, and the South has sort of forgotten about that. And he brings that up, that in the North we still remember this, and so we still have our Northern Lights, basically. Where are the Southern Lights? And that's why those early episodes of Book 2, I think, are so significant, because as much as, yes, it is Unalaq using Korra, he has to train her to become spiritual to get what he wants from her, it gives you an insight into Unalaq as he is when he's not being extreme, because he has to be an honest teacher to her in those early moments. And so I think this is where you really get the positive side of Unalaq's ideology of, he just wants the world to be more spiritual. He wants to help people to be more spiritual so that man can respect spirits more and open up the door to the eventual return of spirits into the world. If he had his way, I think in the earlier years when he was younger, before the Red Lotus stuff and Vaatu, I think he very much would want what Korra eventually does, which is to open the portals and try for some type of peace and balance between humans and spirits. That's because ultimately within the franchise, that is what true balance actually is. It's not just that there's no war between humans going on, it's also about the balance between humans and spirits. Because there are two worlds, and it has to be this double balance of both balance of humans and spirits in the physical world, but also in the spirit world also. So that's why I've always very much liked Unalaq and the idea that they take with him of, he tries so hard to, point out, like, why aren't you spiritual? Look at the effect you're having on the world. Dark spirits are attacking people. And no one listens, really. No one changes because of this. And you see that sort of evidenced by the fact of, like, at the start of Book 2, who is Korra's spiritual teacher? It's Tenzin. What is Tenzin not very good at? Being spiritual, but he still tries to be that teacher to her. And that's a lesson Tenzin has to learn. But Unalaq has the skills that he can teach her that will actually help her. That the fact that this is a guy who has developed a waterbending technique that can purify spirits signals to you how truly spiritual, sort of on another level, he is with regards to spirituality. And that he was absolutely needed for Korra at that point. Because if not for the Unalaq stuff, she wouldn't have learned about the portals and their significance. She wouldn't have ever really, I think, come into contact with, the backstory about the Avatar and found out about Rava, Vaatu, and the balance, how the spirit world truly actually works. Unalaq is kind of what really opens the door to her, and then it's the personal advice of Tenzin and Jinora as being an actual sort of friend who is a spiritual guide to her, who are the key people later on in her life. But I think Unalaq plays a great role because he is family. He has that dynamic with Korra, that he's her uncle, and he also has this issue with his brother. He dislikes his brother because his brother is the exact opposite of him. Tonraq is borderline anti-spiritual, whereas Unalaq is completely spiritual. Look at the two's waterbending style. Tonraq's waterbending style is very kind of physical. He kind of charges in, goes for sort of like ice fists and stuff like that. Big chunks of ice is what he sort of rides around on. Whereas Unalaq has a more sort of elegant, flowing style, and even some techniques that are completely spiritual in nature, not relating to combat. That defines the difference between the two of them. And he was the one next in line for the kind of position of chief in the north. And that's why Unalaq does what he does in the past in terms of blaming the destruction of the spirit forest, sort of setting up that incident to get Tonraq banished. And you begin to see that manipulation come into play of, like, the north is going to become spiritually kind of corrupted if he becomes the leader. That's Unalaq's point of view in the whole thing. And then in the middle of all of this, he becomes part of the Red Lotus with Zahir, and what we see happens. So we see that Unalaq does have this positive point to him. The value that he brings is that it is correct. The world is at a point now where Juan's decision to keep the portals open was good for his time. there needed to be that separation after what happened with the Lion Turtles needing to step in. But it's been long enough now where it's probably about time to try and fix things. Humans now have this proper foothold in their world. It's their world because they're the physical beings in the physical world. If they can learn to share that world to some degree with the spirits, and the spirits share the spirit world with humans, that is exactly what the world needs. And this is something that Korra keeps in mind at the end of the book. She defeats Unalaq using the technique he taught her. She spirit bends him to defeat him, purifies him, even says go in peace at the end, because she knows she's killing her uncle basically in that moment, but also that she's saving him from just forever being part of Unavatu. But afterwards, instead of just going back to the way things were, trusting the wisdom of the first Avatar to keep the portals closed, she questions it. Should I keep them open? And that comes from her journey in book 2, but it also comes from, I think, what Unalaq has said to her. There's value in what he said. It's not all, again, it's the idea of just because the villain goes extreme doesn't mean you dismiss everything that they say as being extreme. And so she takes that into mind and decides to leave them open, and that this is what the world needs. And absolutely, her experiences with Unalaq is what informs so much of what she goes through. The other thing, and I think it's the final point I have really about Unalaq, is just the idea of the spiritual character who takes his spirituality so far that he prioritizes spirits above humans to an insane degree, to the point where he basically gives up his humanity to Vatu. When he merges into Unavatu, Unavatu takes over his body completely. Like, the second he sort of grows in size, Unalaq pretty much is gone as sort of like a consciousness, I think, as part of that that duo. That is an example of the spirit and human not really working in tandem, but one taking over the other. Whereas in the Avatar, Rava, when she even becomes more active, like in the Avatar state, doesn't take over the body. Instead, it's just the glow sort of starts to like come out, but she doesn't alter the Avatar's body as such. So there's more of a respect there, a true balance, rather than what the Dark Avatar is. And you saw the development in that path. That book 2 spirits, it's about spirits. That's what the book is about. But it's also about family. A lot of people dismiss a lot of the earlier episodes in the book as being like the weaker episodes. But that's where a lot of that secondary theme comes into play, of showing you Unalaq's relationship with his kids, Eska and Desna, with his brother, Tonraq, with his niece, Korra. It's where you see Tenzin and his siblings. It's where you see like Iki running away after an incident with her siblings. And they deal with all of these familial issues of just the importance of family. And you get kind of big arcs like the conflict between Tonraq and Unalaq. In a way, the issue of Tenzin and Jinora over who is going to be Korra's spiritual guide. A lot of key dynamics that heavily relate to family and how family is important. But who's the one character in like the whole book who sort of forgets about family? It's Unalaq. He prioritized spirituality above everything, to the point where he doesn't care when Desna gets injured trying to force the portal open. He doesn't care. Like, there's barely a mention of his wife and her just being left behind and him doing all this stuff and not in any way caring about her. Tonraq, who probably shouldn't offer his hand to his brother, does, despite everything that happened in the past between them, because he still cares about him as family. But Unalaq doesn't feel the same. That's probably the big moment in the book of Tonraq showing the type of character that he actually is deep down by offering that hand to his brother, but his brother just not taking it. And then most, I suppose, importantly, him morphing with Vatu to become Unavatu as Eska and Desna watch on and see their father just be gone. And in the end they realize this is what he cared about, nothing else. And I think that is interesting. Like, Unalaq is not, in terms of his personality, obviously isn't the most like charismatic character compared to Amon, Tarlok, who have all these like leadership skills, can give an amazing speech. Unalaq is more of just a sort of guy who's in a leadership position, who's spiritual, and he's kind of fairly normal. He's a good teacher, but that's it. He's not meant to be seen as a Kuvira level leader or commander type thing, or the same sort of almost like manic quality that like Zahir and some of the Red Lotus members have with how chaotic they are. He's more composed and kind of neutral for a lot of the cases, but he still has that manipulative side to his personality with what he does in the early sections of the book and how he plays some things as the book goes on. I think a lot of people do very much sort of not attempt even to analyze Unalaq all that much and just dismiss him as being spirit stuff, when it's actually very, very important. And the point that Toph makes in book 4 about learning from your villains most applies to Korra and Unalaq. I definitely maintain that of all the villains from book 1, 2, and 3, Korra learns the most from Unalaq. Because as I said, with Amon, it's more of just stuff changes in the aftermath rather than sort of Korra changing necessarily. Her change is more subtle in relation to her dealings with Amon. Whereas with Unalaq, it's very clear of the speech at the end, keeping the portals open, all that sort of stuff, her spiritual growth in that season. And even going into book 3, I don't really think Korra changes that much due to her experiences with Zahir, outside of just the fact that like that causes her injury and it sets up book 4 and what goes on there. So yeah, that is book 2 and Unalaq. Of course, like Varric is there in book 2 as well as being a villain initially, but definitely more of the kind of side villain, and they're so kind of comedic with him that like they never overly want you to think of him as being a villain. So, you know, I don't think there's really that much need to discuss Varric in this, because I don't think most people ultimately view him as a villain. So going into book 3 change, we have the Red Lotus, and we have 4 characters here as part of an organization. So it's a much more complicated thing going on here. 4 unique characters, and then those 4 characters are part of a new organization that relates to another organization. And then it also retroactively reveals Unalaq was part of the Red Lotus also. So this book reveals more about Unalaq, and as well as all this stuff. With the Red Lotus, what Toph says about Zahir is that Zahir cared about freedom. And I do notice it's a little vague, of just like he cared about freedom rather than like he effected change of like equality. He brought the spirits back. In this case, it's just he cared about freedom, because I do maintain that I think the Red Lotus are the villains from Korra that are the most sort of difficult to relate to. As I've discussed with Amon and Unalaq already, I think there's a level of like you can get behind the point that they're getting at. That like you see the inequality in Republic City, and so you can see that point and why it's such a problem that Amon has gone extreme. He's sort of defeated the point almost with what he's doing. The same with Unalaq. You respect the idea of like, yeah, it would be cool to see humans and spirits respect each other and spirits back in the world. That would be amazing to see the world in true balance. But going about it by, you know, becoming the dark avatar and turning the world completely dark, prioritizing spirits above humans to the point where humans are probably going to be wiped out in this era of chaos if you succeed properly, is not the way to tackle it. But your idea initially was good. With the Red Lotus, you don't quite connect to necessarily what the initial good ideal was so much. And I think it comes down to a few reasons. One is that they go so extreme so early on of, we're going to kill all the world leaders, and then by the end of the book, we also want to end the Avatar cycle for good. And it's like, okay, so the good ideal here is that they care about freedom. The way to view it, I think, more is that they have issues with world leaders. I don't think they go enough in depth in terms of having any sort of what I would consider sort of nuanced take on the world leaders, because the one thing they try and do in this book with that is that Korra, of course, has issues with Queen Hu Ting prior to her death. In the earlier episodes of Book 3, Korra goes to the Queen and has some huge issues there. There's a whole two-parter that happens quite early on that relates to her. And then later on, the Red Lotus come in and kill the Queen. And they talk about how, Zahir gives his speech of, freedom is essential to the people as he kills her. And he makes the connection to, just like air is essential to breathe, it's important to the people to have freedom, and he kills it. He takes away her air, takes away her freedom by killing her. That's a big scene that everyone remembers, of course. But what informs Zahir or any of the other Red Lotus members' view on freedom? Because they never really tell you what the ideals of the Red Lotus are, necessarily. All they say is just that it's a spin-off group from the White Lotus. This guy called Xiaobao in the past defected from the Order of the White Lotus because they disagreed with the way things were going. The White Lotus going public, serving the Avatar. They don't go into any specific details about specific disagreements, just that the Red Lotus forms and has this view of where they support Vaatu, and they would want to train the new Avatar to effectively be a dark Avatar of a different sort than the Unalaq dark Avatar. Just basically an Avatar trained with the Red Lotus philosophy instead of the White Lotus philosophy. But they never really get into what the Red Lotus philosophy is, outside of that they hate world leaders so much that they want to kill them. There's no sense whatsoever about this other system of leadership is better. This style of government is better. Be more like this leader over here. No, it's just that the world will be better without leaders, and that the people should lead themselves and have freedom. And it's fine and all, and there's a ring to it in a way. But at the same time, you immediately see the flaw of that. Of the second the Queen goes down, the Earth Kingdom just kind of splits apart. It's complete chaos. We now know that it's effectively, the bandits, the Dao Fei of the Earth Kingdom, who are so sort of prevalent, who are the ones who cause a lot of the issues the second the power structure fails. And who are the people who benefit? It's the people who would do riots and stuff like that. The people like Zahir who want chaos. The people who suffer are the normal people like Mako and Bolin's family, who aren't going to thrive in this chaotic environment and value some level of structure to keep going and survive. So in that sense, I think it's a much harder thing to properly get behind exactly what the Red Lotus are going for. I understand the sort of appeal of them because they're this cool group with all these characters who have crazy abilities and stuff like that, and they're out to kill and stuff like that, but I don't think there's that same appeal of just the equality that Amon wants, or the want for the world to be more spiritual that Unalaq has, because I don't think there's ever the sense that you can really picture the group wanting to achieve freedom in a way that kind of isn't extreme, almost. At least that's my view on it. I just can't see what it is, because it feels like the Red Lotus forms by wanting to be extreme. And just by definition, the organization is a more extreme version of everything, and that's all that they're about. And that's where just the lack of detail on the Red Lotus as an organization comes into play, and the lack of detail on the characters comes into play. Because this is where, to me, the Red Lotus sort of fall flat a little bit. They're great in terms of cool abilities, and a lot of the way they're presented and how cool they are is fantastic. But their motivation isn't really there. It's an interesting thing, kill the leaders. But why? Is the question. You get a slight sense of it with the little bit of backstory they present for Pali, that she was the prisoner of a warlord, and that's when Zahir saved her. That's where Pali's view of freedom comes from, of being saved by Zahir. The other three, not so much. And you can't say it's because they were in prison, because they were part of the Red Lotus, and the attempt to kidnap Korra was what got them in prison in the first place. So they believed in freedom prior to that. So their stay in prison wasn't what informed it. So what happened earlier in their lives for four characters to care so much about freedom? Police is the one that makes the most sense because they present the only piece of information that actually relates to the topic. So let's kind of talk about this a little bit with the other characters. Let's go to Minghua. I think hers you can sort of fit together where it is. Okay, Water Tribe. Realistically, Northern Water Tribe. That way you can have the connection between Minghua and Unalaq potentially of like how she came to join the group. Northern Water Tribe allows you to have the sort of issue with the stricter customs potentially. The fact that she is a bender but doesn't have arms, like was she restricted in getting training and that sort of stuff, but then Unalaq offered her that training. There's the unique aspect of like, is Minghua's technique actually psychic waterbending, or is she manipulating the water for her arms in some different way? Did Unalaq teach her that? It's kind of unclear, but you can see a few of the connections you can make of Unalaq was the leader. He's from the Northern Water Tribe. She probably is as well. Where does the freedom come into play? Was she not free to pursue being a bender because of her disability? Because we know she was born without arms. It wasn't an accident or anything like that. There's a way to make that happen. And then when she is part of the group, you can characterize her and Ghazan because they tease the idea that maybe the two of them like each other. That's one of the few facts that we sort of get in terms of details about the characters. So you can sort of maybe connect some dots, but fundamentally the show itself doesn't say anything either way on the topic. With Ghazan, who again is kind of very similar to Minghua in terms of like we know very little about him, he has a unique ability, kind of like Pali, of lava bending. Very powerful ability that I suppose leaders would want. What if his family was affected by whoever was in charge of whatever Earth Kingdom town he was from and targeted him because of his ability? That would lead for him to believe that he's not free. He's forced to do stuff because of this technique or whatever. Who thought him lava bending? There's a few little bits of information we get on Ghazan is that Bolin says, I think, 3 things, and Ghazan says 2 of them are correct, 1 isn't. You are led to believe that the one that isn't correct is the thing about his mustache growing in very early, and that the 2 correct things are that he and Minghua like each other, and then the most important thing, raised by an older sister. That's a very, very interesting point in that it suggests something happened to their parents earlier on, and then also where is the older sister? Did something happen to her to inform where Ghazan is at this point in his life? He has tattoos. Now, we've seen other Earth Kingdom people with tattoos that I think are kind of like that, so it doesn't inherently mean that he's from a specific tribe or anything like that, but it might suggest a few different locations he could be from, and if they want to address maybe some of the origins of is there anything that connects people who are lava benders, that anything in the sort of lineage that would lead to people being more likely to be lava benders, perhaps. I touched on Pali already, but in terms of a more detailed viewpoint, it's obviously the Warlord. Fire Islands is the obvious connection to make, so one of the islands probably relatively far away from the Fire Nation mainland. A few connections you'd make here would be Pali is a combustion bending. Combustion bending is one of the rarest abilities in the world. It's one of the most powerful abilities in the world, and that there's only 2 characters we know with it in the entire franchise. That's extremely rare. The 2 people who have it are both exceptionally tall, both have tattoos on their forehead. How did they know to get them? Is it that people from a specific fire island are maybe more likely to be combustion benders? Is there some lineage connection between Pali and Combustion Man somewhere down the line? And just how did she learn to harness her abilities? Because she of course manages to develop it far beyond what Combustion Man could do, and that she can curve her blasts, and she didn't seem to have injured herself earlier on in her training like Combustion Man did with blowing one of his arms and one of his legs off while discovering that technique when he was younger. So how did the Warlord hear about it? What was she used for? How did Zahir come across her? The specifics around her being saved. but at least the connection of freedom comes in there. You sort of have to make up your own story for the other characters. Zahir then actually ends up being arguably the more complicated character to come up with where his view on freedom actually comes from. And what's the most interesting about that is Zahir, despite being the leader and the most charismatic of the group, is the most normal otherwise. He, as we meet him at the start, is just an airbender who got airbending with harmonic convergence. Later on, he gets flight and becomes more of like a special airbender and a different type of character. But then before that, he's just a non-bender kind of martial artist, kind of warrior character who also is interested in poetry, from Gurulahima specifically, and seems to know a decent amount about airbender culture. Why was he interested in that? What nation is he actually from in the first place? He says that as a teenager he met Unalaq and they came to join the Red Lotus. How did he meet Unalaq? What led him there? And more specifically, what informs his issue with world leaders and obsession in a way with freedom? Because I don't know if you can just say that the Red Lotus as an organization just super cares about freedom. I don't know if they quite say that. So to me, you have to make it more personal in the same way that clearly spirituality is very personally important to Unalaq. And equality from Amon and Tarlok's backstory is important to them. Well, Amon specifically. So that's why he thinks bending ruined his family, and that informs why he does what he does. In this case, we don't quite get why they are willing to kill world leaders and the Avatar to bring about chaos and, in their mind, I suppose, this chaotic version of freedom. And that's where I've always just had a slight disconnect with the Red Lotus in the book. I've never felt like they are the villains who connect the most with Korra. They feel the most disconnected from her in that they are the ones who are the straight up villains. She has no relation to them at all. She can't see their viewpoint. She has issues with world leaders as well, but she would never go as far as to want to kill them as the way to solve the problems. And so immediately there's just, we do not agree. She calls like what he's talking about philosophical mumbo jumbo in their first conversation together, and that's about it. And then after that, she's pretty much just pursued by the Red Lotus because she is the Avatar, and there's no personal dynamic between them either. So that's why I'd say, of like, in terms of like analysis on the Red Lotus, they end up sort of falling just a little bit short compared to some of the other villains, just because I don't think there's the material there to connect everything together as effectively as some of the other villains, where like the backstory sort of almost fills itself in a little bit more for Amon, for Unalaq and Tarlok and stuff like that. Here, you can picture kind of the path, but there's so much to be filled in because it's 4 characters, it's a full organization, in that Zhai Bao, the founder of the Red Lotus, left the Order of the White Lotus. Why? Like, they say it's because they disagreed with like the direction of the Order of the White Lotus going public. But why? That's not much of a reason behind this massive disagreement, to the point where one supports the Avatar and one is killing world leaders again. It's a big contrast. The interesting thing with Zhai Bao, and probably prompts a bit of an origin story on the Red Lotus and the character, is that in the Legacy of the Fire Nation book, Iroh directly mentions Zhai Bao as a character, so he knows him. He is active in ATLA time period where we are right now. They could tell this story. This could happen right now with the characters at the ages that they are right now, pretty much in the comics. Like, Zahir almost mentions it in Korra, like Zhai Bao is this ancient character. But he's actually only from about, like 70-ish years ago, if even that. It might only be like 50 or something. So he's there and thereabouts. Like, Zhai Bao is not this character we have to go into the past to find out about. He's right there in Avatar time period. There's a way to tell that story, and I think it needs to be told. In the same way that I ultimately feel at this point, 2020, I don't think we know that much about the Order of the White Lotus either, let alone the conflict between the two, or the fact that the Red Lotus is a big thing. Like, I'll always appreciate the book for having that interesting dynamic. The action scenes are incredible throughout book 3, of course, and it's helped by the fact that you have three benders with incredible powers, unique styles, and then use Zahir as being a more charismatic villain. They just need the extra backstory to fully back up everything they're saying, because otherwise it just feels a little bit like Toph says. Amon was all about equality. Unalaq brought the spirits back, and Zahir cared about freedom. It's just kind of like, did he? I guess, kind of. He said freedom once or twice, but you don't make the connection as much between the extreme and the positive viewpoint, because it wasn't touched on that much. They were more focused on showing them as being like fighters and stuff like that, rather than the opposite style side of things. So we'll move into Book 4, Balance, and we have Kuvira as our villain here. And this is where it gets interesting, because the end of the Red Lotus, of course, stems immediately into they cause the situation that creates the kind of gap for Kuvira to fill in. And this is a great kind of setup for like a character turning from being more of a hero character, we met her a little bit in Book 3, into being the villain. The transformation from Zaofu guard into being dictator. Of Korra's out of action, she can't help at the moment. She's recovering from serious injury. Sue is unwilling to become a dictator in any way. It's just against who she is. She will not fill in. And so Kuvira steps up to the plate. She decides she is going to step in and stabilize the Earth Kingdom. And this is all informed for Kuvira by the fact that she was abandoned as a child by her parents, and so she doesn't want the people of the Earth Kingdom to feel like they're abandoned. Like, she views Su Yin as abandoning them. She views Korra being out of action, recovering from injury, as sort of like not being there, not being present, abandoning them. So Kuvira will be the one to protect them, to step in, stabilize things, and make it so that no one ever has to experience the same sort of stuff that she went through. Now, Kuvira is very interesting because we have, of course, Runes of the Empire since the show has come to an end, and it gives some extra nuance into a lot of the Kuvira dynamics. Mainly the idea that we're perhaps not meant to be as like super sympathetic towards Kuvira in relation to what happened with her parents, because the way they say it, it's meant to be this extremely sympathetic thing in Book 4 of Korra realizing like, oh, like you're an orphan, and it comes out that like, my parents abandoned me, and she talks about it. But in Runes of the Empire, you find out that yes, her parents abandoned her in the sense that they gave her away. They gave her away to Sue. But the reason behind it wasn't because they were just like, I think, inherently bad parents. It was because Kuvira had pretty big behavioral issues when she was younger. She had huge trouble controlling her anger and her emotions, and would often have violent outbursts. And that coming from a younger child who was just developing the abilities of earthbending, and someone with such high potential for earthbending, you can see the problem with non-bender parents of like, if she's acting out, they mention like she nearly killed, I think it was her mother, they say, she nearly killed her mother in one of these kind of like outbursts. And so there's a level of understanding of like, her parents just couldn't handle her from like a physical point of view or just her behavior. So they handed her off to someone who could handle her on that physical level and train her in earthbending, and was willing to try and help her with her issues. And that's why Su Yin is a very important person in Kuvira's life. That yes, you are meant to be sympathetic to the idea that her parents did give her away. Kuvira feels that sense of abandonment, of being left away, handed off to someone else by her own parents. And she feels that like, oh, and then you took me in at this low moment in my life. And then at the end of Runes of the Empire, she acknowledges that to Sue, of like, you saved me at this lowest ebb of my life, and you've been a true mother to me, more than my actual parents. But she sees Sue not stepping in as a big act of betrayal, almost just as bad as an act of abandonment as what her parents did. And that's what creates such a rift between Sue and Kuvira. Now, what's missing in my mind with Kuvira in terms of backstory is purely that we see very little of Kuvira interacting with the rest of the Bei Fongs. We see a little sequence of Kuvira interacting with Opal, kind of highlighting that like they didn't get on initially, but I think we didn't get to see Kuvira interacting with Batar earlier, or any of the others really, just being part of the family. And I think that would have helped to more inform why it was such a betrayal. Because up until Ruins of the Empire, you could have absolutely had the valid viewpoint that Kuvira, they mentioned that like Kuvira was adopted by Sue, but you could just have the viewpoint of like, yes, we adopted her and we looked after her, but like she wasn't like part of the family. Like we made sure she was safe and stuff like that. She had a relation to the family, but she wasn't directly there, like sister to Opal and stuff like that. But that actually is the case. It was how kind of relatively unclear some of the details surrounding this were, in that they didn't get to go into it. And so you saw a very hurt Opal, very hurt Sue in relation to what Kuvira did. But you didn't connect to it as much because we didn't have the context. They didn't really show us the scene of Kuvira leaving with Batar, where that relationship came from, the intent behind it. You kind of get it a little bit more now, but even after the comic, you still want to see more of that as she goes on her sort of redemption path, which is very interesting that Kuvira, of all of the Korra villains, is the one villain they're really giving a redemption to. I suppose you could say Varric got his redemption from being the sort of minor villain of Book 2. But in terms of main villain, that's the opportunity they're giving to Kuvira, is to redeem herself, and it looks like it's going to happen. The same with, I suppose, Batar Jr. But with Kuvira, you could say, like, her thing, if Toph had spoken to Korra after Book 4, would have been that, what did you learn from Kuvira? It probably was the idea of sort of, stability in a way, like feeling like you're doing your duty to your nation, stepping in to stabilize a world in chaos. That's what she did. And that's what I actually liked at the start of Ruins of the Empire, was Kuvira willing to stand up for herself and say that I brought stability to the Earth Kingdom. I did that. No one else would. What would the world be like if Kuvira didn't decide to do that? Obviously, we saw that what it did to her was it turned her into the Great Uniter, and we saw that the extremes on Kuvira's side of things were quite heavy. It was quite different than her initial goal of like wanting people to feel safe and secure and not feel abandoned. It was like re-education camps for people not originally of Earth Kingdom origin, basically almost like enslaving people to a degree with that. Now, the comic tries to frame it more in the way that Kuvira wasn't as aware as you would expect about the full extent of what was going on in the re-education camps. Her intent with them was kind of actually to sort of help people to have a better viewpoint, rather than them to be, as Dr. Shen goes on to do in Ruins of the Empire, to do actual brainwashing, or to actually enslave people who disagree. They were just kind of like, that's your usual style of things, what's wrong with this? But Kuvira wouldn't actually do that, because we see her personality, it's very controlling. She wants to accomplish stuff herself, not by necessarily technical means like that. But you see how far she goes. She doesn't just stabilize the chaotic parts of the Earth Kingdom, which is basically everywhere except Republic City and Zaofu, which are able to sort of be strong on their own. She goes after Zaofu, in many ways just to sort of get one over on Sue for what she did. And then she goes after Republic City because she suddenly is intent on reclaiming old Earth Kingdom land from before Republic City formed. And these are obviously points that you can't really agree with, because there's no value really in them. You can't see the positives that she's going to achieve. She wants to make it this idea of it's a reunited Earth Kingdom, no more kind of like individual states or whatever. But it's the wrong path, everyone being united under just a different sort of dictator now. Again, the point that's made here, the positive that you take away though, is that what does it say about the way the Earth Kingdom was led that the death of one central leader led to utter chaos. Like the kingdom fell apart and needed an army to come in and basically take over the entire landmass again to restabilize it. What does that say about the quality of your leadership? And it leads, of course, to what happens at the end of Book 4, which is Wu deciding that basically the world doesn't need an Earth King anymore. He's going to step down. There's going to be elections in the different states about, each state will elect their own kind of representative, and so we'll transition into a democracy for the Earth Kingdom. This will help. There'll be more individual sort of governance over specific areas rather than just central bossing say government. It's going to work. Of course, Ruins of the Empire places more nuance on the idea of Wu was maybe a little bit too idealistic, a little bit too quick, a little bit too eager to leave the role of Earth King and not take it on at all. And in the end, the conclusion that they come to is that they need to keep things stable for a while, and Wu is actually an okay leader. He can be the sort of interim Earth King until they can slowly and surely, properly do the elections in the states. So they will have to change, it just has to be a little bit slower and not as fast. Because it's a good point, I think, that Ruins of the Empire makes of like, is that what we really want to do? Just, it's broken with the death of the Earth Queen. We're immediately, upon stabilization, getting rid of the role of king or queen and elections straight away within the next couple of weeks. That's crazy in terms of sudden shifts in governance, so they have to do it slower. It makes a lot more sense. But it's the idea of Kuvira sort of helped to point this out. Her stability of kind of coming in there and fixing it showed the problem, that like this is how bad it was and it was needed to be fixed. Because I think a lot of the material in Avatar gets across that idea that the leadership within the Earth Kingdom has been bad for generations. I think even the Kyoshi novels are going super heavy in that direction, and that plays into all the stuff from like even before the Kyoshi novels came out, the Kyoshi backstory stuff that we had with the peasant uprising, Chin the Conqueror, and I think even going back before then, just the king within the walls has been a bad idea for a while for such a giant nation. It just doesn't work. So that's the positive to take away, and that there was good intent behind what Kuvira did. She just became something wrong along the way and made a lot of mistakes. And the connection that was good, I think, in Book 4 was highlighting how similar she and Korra are in terms of being so driven that Kuvira felt she had to do something with the way the Earth Kingdom was. And that's how Korra often feels about certain situations. When she encounters something, she wants to do something to fix it. And so they're pointing out that similarity behind how driven and passionate they can be about these type of things, even if sometimes they immediately approach tackling it in perhaps the wrong way. And that's the good similarity of it, and that's what worked, I think, throughout Book 4, was just getting across that idea of like Korra facing Kuvira. What exactly is she facing here? She's kind of facing this like alternate version of herself. She's facing someone who's doing something to a degree she would have done, not in the same way, but similar. And that's why it's so important that you have that scene of Korra understanding Kuvira at the end, and not just you're the villain, you need to go down, but showing a level of understanding at the end. And then in the comics, getting this nice dynamic of Korra being able to see before everyone else Kuvira is changing, has changed, and her being the one to stick to her guns on that despite some doubts, when other people were like, no, Kuvira cannot change, she won't change, but she has. And I think that does really, really work in my mind. So I think that's going to bring the video to an end. It's like an hour long already, but I wanted to go in depth here on all the villains, and I think I did an okay job here. Again, there's actually so much detail to a lot of it. I probably could have done like an hour on like every villain, but like that would have been a bit too much. So in the comments, obviously, let's continue this discussion here in the comments about the villains from Book 1, 2, 3, and 4. their strengths, their weaknesses, where more story could be added for them, the idea of what their ideology was, both from their extreme point of view as well as their sort of the positives behind it all, I suppose, that do eventually reach Korra, those ideals. What are your thoughts on them? But yeah, that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.